Okay, we need to go to BHP's presentation. You have 15 minutes. Mr. Risner.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Shiprock Chapter for their hospitality in hosting this event today. My name is Pat Risner. I'm the Asset President for BHP Billiton, New Mexico Coal. So I have responsibility for all of our operations in San Juan County, both Navajo Mine and San Juan Mine. Some of you know me, some of you don't, so just briefly on my background, I moved to the area 21 years ago from Oklahoma, where I grew up, to be an engineer at Navajo Mine. And I've worked in all of our operations in the area over the last 20 years. It was also good to hear your presentation and the concerns first, because everything you raised are things that do need to be considered as to whether the Navajo Nation should acquire Navajo Mine. They're all valid points that need to be taken into account. What I would like to do is share how this came about so that everyone understands why the transaction being successful, the sale being successful, is critical for the Navajo Nation and for this community. The bottom line and the real issue is, without successful completion of this sale, Navajo Mine and the Four Corners Power Plant close in 3 years, in 2016. The businesses can't go beyond that point if we aren't successful with this transaction. So what comes with that is the potential loss of 1,000 direct jobs for people that are employed at Navajo Mine and the Four Corners Power Plant. The loss of those jobs and their families and extended families that are supported by those jobs. In addition, there's a direct tax and royalty revenue generated from the mine and the power plant that are about 1/3 of the Navajo Nation's general fund. It preserves that for another 15 years beyond 2016. And also, one that's often overlooked is the taxes and royalties that come from the mining operation from the power plant, and the support for the mining operation and the power plant from vendors and suppliers in these communities result in another 1,500 jobs on top of the 1,000 that are employed at the mine. So you're talking about on the order of 2,500 direct and indirect jobs impacted in 3 years' time if we aren't successful with this. So all of these factors need to be considered in terms of support for the transaction or not. We understand there's going to be different points of view on this, and the environmental issues and risks around those certainly do need to be taken into account. But we think most would agree that closure of these businesses in 3 years' time, the loss of the jobs and those economic benefits potentially would have an adverse impact on the communities in the region. And that's why we made the decision to look at this and to pursue this as a company to sustain these businesses for the stakeholders that depend on them. A little bit about how that came about. I think you're aware our agreements with the Four Corners Power Plant owners for coal supply expire in 2016, as do the lease agreements and a number of other agreements that are out there. We worked for about 2 years to try to come to a resolution on a new agreement beyond 2016 that would provide the coal at a cost that allowed the owners of the power plant the investment for the mine and the power plant to survive after 2016. At that point, we could have just said, well, this doesn't work. We're going to have to close down in 2016. For BHP Billiton as an organization, that was an unacceptable outcome. An unacceptable outcome for the 1,000 families that are supported by those direct jobs, as well as the others that support our operations. It was an unacceptable outcome for the Navajo Nation that depends on that revenue. It was an unacceptable outcome for the communities and people around the mine that depend on support from our operations. So we started to explore other ways in which these agreements could be finalized and other ways in which it could work. We approached the Navajo Nation about a year ago about potentially restructuring ownership. The reason that works is because it lowers the cost of coal to the customer, allows them to make investments in the plant that enable us to go ahead and move on and operate the businesses past 2016. With the mine owned by BHP Billiton, we pay taxes to 3 governments because we're a private company: the federal government, the state government, the Navajo Nation government. With Navajo Nation ownership as a sovereign entity, as a sovereign government, pay some of those taxes. It lowers the cost of coal to the customer, allows these agreements to be made, allows the mine and the power plant to be viable into the future, and allows us to preserve those jobs. Navajo Mine is still a good operation. Quality people is the main reason, but also a quality resource. When we approached the Navajo Nation about this, obviously they needed to take the time to evaluate whether this was a sound investment for the Navajo Nation and for the people. So they put a team together. We provided thousands of pages of documents about every aspect of the mine. They brought in outside expertise on mining to evaluate all this. They looked at our mine plans, our financial projections for the mine, the past performance, environmental risks, environmental monitoring data, to determine if it was a sound investment and to assess the risks. Coal quality was something that was looked at. That was an issue raised here. The picture on the top on Navajo Mine, that actually wasn't coal in the picture. We have 80 to 90 years of coal reserves at Navajo Mine at the same quality we're mining today. But the quality and reserves are something that were evaluated by this team, as was everything else. The results were reported to the Navajo Nation Council in April, and it was determined that yes, under Navajo Nation ownership, they could provide a coal price to make both businesses sustainable and could actually generate additional value and cash flow as owners of the mine. As a result, the Navajo Nation Council, as you know, took action to charter the Navajo Transitional Energy Company, which is the tribally owned company that would acquire the mine. As part of this, some of these risks were assessed. The discussion around coal ash, we've studied and monitored those areas in the mine for many, many years. We have an extensive amount of data we've collected around where coal ash has been placed in the mine. The picture of the ash facility at APS is actually not part of the mine and not something that the Navajo Nation would acquire by acquiring the mine. But the U.S. Office of Surface Mining, the BIA, and other federal agencies have studied placement of coal ash into the mine numerous times. And all of those studies have come back with the same results. As recent as last year, the Office of Surface Mining conducted a study around coal ash placement at Navajo Mine with the data that's been collected. And the outcomes of that study were that the coal ash placement has not impacted surface or groundwater and is unlikely to impact surface or groundwater into the future. Probably saw in the paper this morning, we do the same thing at San Juan Mine. The University of New Mexico just finished a study evaluating the same things over there and came to the same conclusions. So we've managed these activities in a way that are consistent with our values. And the first value, if you look at our company charter, is an overriding commitment to the health, safety, and environment for our people. And the monitoring data and the studies that have been done on this over the years show that. The EIS was referenced earlier. We actually advocated very early on that there need to be a thorough analysis of all environmental impacts if the mine and power plant were going to run past 2016. We've supported this process by providing resources and information and data for the federal agencies to assess these risks, and we believe they do need to take a hard look, so we support that process. As part of us staying on to continue to operate the mine for the next 3 years, which is what will happen if the sale occurs, we've committed to continue to support this EIS process by continuing to provide information and resources so that the agencies can make a sound decision around the impacts. So hopefully you see that there's been a thorough evaluation of this and you see what's at stake if we're not successful. It's a unique opportunity for the Navajo Nation to own a business that's significant, to preserve the jobs and economic benefits that flow from that business. About 80% of those 1,000 employees are Navajo tribal members. 85% at Navajo Mine. Many of you probably know someone that works out there. But it's also important for people that don't work out there. Arizona State University just completed a study around the economic impacts of Four Corners Power Plant and Navajo Mine for this post-2016 period. And it showed that it has a $5.6 billion impact on the region. It confirmed the job numbers I talked about earlier, 2,500 direct and indirect jobs, and almost $2 billion in direct income for the Navajo Nation. So we recognize there are going to be concerns around this. But even if you believe we should be transitioning away from coal-based electricity as soon as possible, We have to think about whether our communities are ready for that in 2016. And for us, the decision to pursue this was really around preserving those benefits, preserving those jobs for the families, extended families, communities, and all the stakeholders that depend on Navajo Mine and the Four Corners Power Plant. That's our perspective in terms of why we pursued this. There are certainly every other aspects that need to be evaluated. The coal that's going to the Four Corners Power Plant from Navajo Mine is a Navajo resource. We've been a guest there for 50 years now. It's on Navajo land, and it's produced predominantly by Navajo people. So at this time, we believe that the Navajo Nation is the natural owner to allow this business to be sustained for another 15 years past 2016. The flow-on economic impacts from this are significant and probably touch most everyone in the room. So that's why we've pursued this. That's the key reason why we've chosen to go down this path and why we've worked very hard and the Navajo Nation's team has worked very hard to try to get this deal to a conclusion to set up the future for everyone involved. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to share our views with you today. We certainly would like to sit down and have further discussions about the concerns and issues raised today. We do believe it needs to be a thorough look at everything. We're more than willing to do that at any time. I'll make my time available. Norman and anyone else on our staff that needs to actually hear the concerns and see if we can come to some sort of resolution on some of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Risner. Questions on BHP's presentation? Mr.
Chapter member here, I have maybe 5 questions for BHP. My first question is there a current environmental damage at the mine site or any future foreseen environmental damage? That's my first question. What's going to happen to the current mine employees' employment benefits? The third one is, why is there a deadline to purchase by Navajo Mine? Why can't the purchase happens after the environmental impact statement that is coming? You talk about deadline. My ninth question about the purchase of the mine. The deadline is near. But you know somebody's going to file a lawsuit. These lawsuits can be heard for years to settle in court. And my last one is, why is there no full public education about the mine purchase by BHP or the Navajo Nation? And those are my questions. Thank you.
In terms of environmental damages, obviously there's no current known identified environmental damages or claims or anything of that nature at the mine. In terms of the future, we've provided everything around the monitoring data, the studies that have been done about every aspect of the mine as part of the Navajo Nation's investigation into this potential purchase. Their outside consultants and experts have reviewed that, and to the extent that they've decided to go ahead and pursue and continue down the path towards the purchase of the mine, we believe that that information has satisfied the concerns, and certainly from our perspective, we don't perceive that there's any long-term environmental liabilities at Navajo Mine. Employee benefits, the key around the transaction is we continue to operate Navajo Mine for the next 3 years, even once the Navajo Nation takes ownership. So we've agreed to do that, to provide a transition period. Navajo Nation has not owned and operated a mine, so we use that 3 years as a transition period. So in that time frame, the employees continue to be employed by BHP Billiton. So their pay and benefits and everything else is unchanged. We have an agreement with our union, the International Union of Operating Engineers, for a 5-year term that outlines pay and benefits for our hourly workforce. That was just agreed in February. That will continue, and we have a commitment that the Navajo Nation will continue to honor that through the time frame, through its term. So employee benefits and pay do not change. Employees continue to work for us for the next 3 years while we operate the mine. The deadline, The deadline really around concluding the deal is nothing to do with our deal with the Navajo Nation. It's primarily to do with the need that the utilities have to make commitments to the environment, the expenditure for the environmental upgrades to the plant by the end of the calendar year. So I think you all know that the purchase has been delayed as the Arizona Corporation Commission considers deregulation in the state of Arizona. So APS and the Four Corners Power Plant owners' ability to commit to the new coal sales agreement has been delayed. Therefore, our sale has been delayed. But the owners, our understanding is the owners of the power plant have to make some commitments by the end of the calendar year to the US EPA and others to proceed with that. So they need to know if our sale is going to happen or not, and if the agreements are going to be entered into. As far as education on the transaction, well, hopefully there was a little bit of information shared today that helped you understand it a little better. When we entered into this with the Navajo Nation, obviously working collaboratively with them to evaluate this, we worked with them in terms of how we should share information. We've largely left it to the Navajo Nation to inform the Navajo people and the Navajo chapters as to what's going on with the transaction, why it occurred. We communicated with the local District 13 chapters that are around the mine site early on as to why we were doing it. But education and sharing of information around the transaction is something we've worked with the Navajo Nation's team on closely and tried to follow their process and procedure for how they wanted us to do that. But hopefully today's session was a little bit helpful in helping you understand the background as to how this came about. This is something we've wanted to do for some time, to share all of the history and how we got to this point and why it's important.